Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Took me a few years, but here I am. So, the 50s marked a turning point for Hollywood. The once dominant studio system was getting weaker and had to contend with a new threat, television. As TV ownership in the US skyrocketed, cinema attendance was in a steady decline. To compete with the small screen, studios attempted to lure audiences away from their televisions and back into cinemas with spectacle and color. The biggest and most lavish productions of the era happened as a result of this, with some studios even risking bankruptcy in the process. It worked for the time being, but it also resulted in majority of studio output to become a bit too formulaic and creatively cautious. Perhaps no genre embodied this mix of formulaic approach and caution more than the Western. Although nearing the end of its golden age, it was the most dominant genre of the decade, both in cinemas and in TV, making up almost a quarter of all studio output in the 50s. But while the genre was in the middle of a creative slump, there were two clear standouts for me: The Searchers, with its iconic sweeping visuals, and Rio Bravo, a film that kind of cemented the concept of hangout movie in cinematic language. But while westerns and lavish historical epics flooded the big screen with their technicolor appeal, there was another side to 1950s Hollywood, a darker, moodier genre that still thrived in the black and white shadows: film noir. Noirs in the 50s weren't pulling any punches. They were often the medium where the more daring artistic visions could be expressed, from the fractured narrative and modern pacing of The Killing to the moral rot of Touch of Evil. But some of the most exciting work of the decade was being produced outside of the US. World cinema was evolving fast. In France, you had Jacques Tati doing a completely unique style of cinema, and then towards the end of the decade you had the French New Wave beginning to form. In Italy, neorealism was morphing into the more poetic and personal visions of directors like Federico Fellini, and in Sweden, Ingmar Bergman was beginning to establish himself as one of the most profound cinematic voices of the 20th century. But perhaps nowhere else was a cinematic movement so fresh and rich in style as in 1950s Japan. While Hitchcock and Wilder dominated Hollywood, Japanese masters Kurosawa, Ozu, and Mizoguchi had an output that could rival any other corner of the world at the time, producing a total of 29 films among them during the 50s. And it wasn't just samurai epics, but social dramas, gothic ghost tales, and family comedies. As with every top 10 list, there's films that didn't quite make the cut, but are absolutely worthy of being included. So here are a few truly brilliant films that in my mind are honestly part of this list. First off, one of the most unique films of the decade, The Night of the Hunter. The only film ever directed by actor Charles Laughton, it's a southern gothic, blending fairy tale imagery and expressionist visuals into something that feels completely apart from anything else in American cinema at the time. It's haunting, dreamlike, and at times terrifying, a true one-of-a-kind experience and stylistically perhaps the most interesting film of the decade. Now, I already talked about the noir genre being a significant part of 50s cinema. There's plenty to pick from. I already mentioned The Killing and Touch of Evil, but there are plenty of others. In a Lonely Place, The Asphalt Jungle, The Sweet Smell of Success. But my personal favorite pure noir of the decade would probably be The Big Heat. It's in many ways visually unremarkable when compared to other noirs of the time, but there's just something about this picture. I just really love Glenn Ford in this film. He is Mr. Vengeance, this unstoppable force for justice, and the weight of his actions loom over the story like a giant dark cloud. You can really feel the destruction. There's something very charming and dark at the same time. Now, the final film I'd like to shout out is All About Eve. This is the perfect movie to throw on with friends. It features probably the wittiest script of the 50s and an incredible ensemble cast spearheaded by Bette Davis, giving what is arguably the best female performance of the decade. It's a film that I already know I'll revisit over the years, not just for its sharp dialogue, but also because of its timeless themes of ambition, jealousy, and aging. That's it for the shoutouts. Let's get into my top 10 films of the 1950s.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
At number 10, Hiroshima, Mon Amour. Hiroshima, Mon Amour is a story about a French actress and a Japanese architect meeting in Hiroshima. What starts as a fleeting love affair becomes something deeper, a meditation on memory, trauma, and the impossibility of forgetting. The film actually started out as a commissioned documentary about the bombing of Hiroshima, but along the way, director Alain Renard turned it into something completely different, and in the process helped spark the French New Wave. I think what makes Hiroshima Mon Amour so remarkable is the contrast it creates. A fleeting, intimate love affair set against one of the darkest tragedies of the 20th century gives the film this haunting power that's unlike anything else from this decade. I love its boldness, the fragmented narrative structure, the way it blends past and present, memory and reality. And then finally, holding everything together is Emmanuelle Riva. She is the heart and soul of this film, and I think she gives what I would call the most emotionally beautiful performance of the decade. It's a great example of a film where it's not important to think, but feel. At number 9, 12 Angry Men. A film where 12 men must decide the fate of a teenager accused of murder. At first, the verdict seems obvious until one juror insists on questioning the evidence, sparking a tense battle of logic, prejudice, and persuasion. I must confess, I did contemplate to keep 12 Angry Men off this list, but I quickly realized how blasphemous that would actually be. I just can't shake the feeling I had after I've seen this film for the very first time years ago, when I barely knew anything about cinema, when it was one of the first black and white films that I've ever seen, and the profound impression it left on me. I remember thinking that this is one of the greatest films ever made. I was completely shook by it, and this must count for something. Its premise and its setting couldn't be simpler, and yet it is a perfect film, one that does the absolute most with the absolute least in many ways. It's not only a profound examination of human nature, but a masterclass in character work, dialogue construction, editing, and lens choices. It's honestly one of the best directed films of this era, and it's also a feature film debut for Sidney Lumet, who had only worked in television before, so it's also not only probably the greatest one-room movie of all time, but also in the conversation for one of the greatest directorial debuts of all time. At number 8, The Bridge on the River Kwai. The Bridge on the River Kwai tells a story of a World War II prisoner camp in the jungles of Burma, where British prisoners are forced by the Japanese captors to build a railway bridge of strategic importance. And the reason I have it on this list is because it's easily one of the best looking, best sounding, and just generally most technically brilliant films of the 50s. When you compare it to other films of the era, it just doesn't feel dated at all. But while it's technically a war film, it also contains very little of what audiences expect from one. No big battles, no front lines, no sweeping combat scenes. It's less about the mechanics of war and more about the psychology of men caught in its structures. Kwai is also a film that's just so British. I guess you could say that in some way it is about Britishness, about the clashing of cultures, of empires, of the pride of two men unwilling to yield. It's for sure about human nature and how principles and discipline can sometimes be the only thing keeping men sane and civilized. At number 7, Singin in the Rain. So what do you say about a film that everything has already kind of been said about? It's the ultimate movie about movies, endlessly rewatchable and often hailed as the greatest musical of all time. Surprisingly, it wasn't a huge hit at first. Musicals at the time just weren't really considered as high art. The slapstick comedy of pieces like Make 'Em Laugh that we consider just incredible displays of artistry today were kind of looked down upon at the time. But in the decades since, Singin in the Rain and its qualities have become clear and obvious, and it's become one of the most beloved and enduring films of its era. And then also, the influence of Singin in the Rain is just everywhere, from pop culture references to countless films that have paid homage to it in its most iconic sequences. Only few films have managed to have this type of influence and also remain so beloved over such a long period of time. Now, if I were to point out one weakness and why this film isn't higher on this list, then I feel like it's just a bit too staged and theatrical at times. And while I get that that is, the part of its whole shtick, I do think that it sometimes gets in the way of connecting with the film on a deeper emotional level, and that's not something I can say about any of the other films remaining on this list. At number 6, Some Like It Hot and Roman Holiday. If there ever was going to be a tie, it just made so much sense to make it between these two films. They're both iconic. They both feature iconic performances from iconic actresses. They have two of the best endings in movie history, in my opinion. First up, we have Some Like It Hot, a film about two struggling musicians played by Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon as they accidentally witness a mob hit in Chicago, and in order to save their lives, they need to run away and join this all-female band on the road, which just leads to the chaos, romance, and mistaken identities, all the while Marilyn Monroe just steals every scene she's in. I mean, she's at the top of her game in this movie. And I think Some Like It Hot is the funnier and edgier of these two films. It's also directed by just the brilliant Billy Wilder. He made some of the most impressive and tonally diverse films of the 50s. And I simply picked Some Like It Hot because I feel like it's the most popular internationally. It's also the one that I feel is my personal favorite. It's similar to All About Eve. It's a great comedy you can always put on with friends. It's a black and white movie that I wouldn't really be afraid of showing to people that don't really watch black and white movies. And then we have Roman Holiday, a film about a young princess wary of her royal duties as she slips away from her handlers during a state visit to Rome. There, she spends a magical day incognito, falling in love with an American reporter played by Gregory Peck. Roman Holiday is a funny film. It's not really the edgy funny like Some Like It Hot, but I think it just makes up for everything with its charm and what I would call a more effortless and believable romance. And while I don't think that Gregory Peck quite reaches the heights of Lemmon and Curtis in this film, he just isn't distracting and never really takes the spotlight away from where it rightfully should be, and that's Audrey Hepburn. And this is Audrey at just her most innocent and beautiful, and her girl-like charm that perhaps no other actress has been able to convey just really shines here. And about William Wyler's direction, in many ways Roman Holiday is much less stylized, and perhaps that's why it feels so natural and its romance so believable. I'm not sure. Wyler took the production to Rome and actually staged the scenes around real landmarks, and I think this gave the film a really authentic and timeless feel that audiences, not just in the US, but I think throughout the world, have really connected with. At number 5, The Human Condition Trilogy. The Human Condition follows Kaji, an idealist Japanese pacifist across the wreckage of World War II. He's forced to choose again and again between survival and his humanity as the morally rotten system that he's a part of tries to break him. From the very first frame, you can tell this is going to be something grand and cinematic. Kobayashi was one of the first in Japan to adopt an ultra-wide format and really put it to good use here. The vast landscapes and horizons are often dwarfing the characters, implying the sheer scale of what's going on in the background. Few films are so universally reflective of the human experience, how ideals collide with survival, and how morality can be eroded or reaffirmed under the weight of history. But if there ever was a true anti-war film, it is The Human Condition. These are films that don't feel shackled by all the censorship constraints that were happening in the West. Kobayashi wanted to make these films for years, but the studio rejected him again and again, fearing that the subject matter was just too grim and too politically sensitive at the time. After all, it depicted the Imperial Japanese Army for what it truly was, brutal and evil, something that isn't fully acknowledged in Japan to this day. Kobayashi kept pushing and eventually threatened to quit unless they gave him the project, and only then did the studio cave. But this isn't your long, drawn-out film studies professors types of films. Kobayashi is, in my opinion, a great entertainer. I think his films are easy to get into, perhaps the easiest out of all the Japanese masters. And once you give him a chance, you will never regret it. At number 4, Ben-Hur. It tells the story of Judah Ben-Hur, a Jewish prince betrayed by his childhood friend and cast into slavery, who initially seeks revenge but ultimately finds redemption in the shadow of Christ. As I already mentioned, the 1950s tried to lure audiences back into theaters with spectacle, and no genre exemplified this better than the biblical epic. During this time, these giant, lavish productions like The Ten Commandments, Quo Vadis, and eventually Cleopatra were produced. And if there was one film that has really stood the test of time and really towers over them, it's Ben-Hur. It is the epic of the epics. When it came out in 1959, it was the biggest film ever made in terms of its budget. MGM bet everything on this one project, almost bankrupting itself in the process. But this huge gamble paid off. Ben-Hur instantly became the kind of cultural event you wouldn't see again until maybe something like Lord of the Rings more than 40 years later. Its most famous sequence, the legendary chariot race, remains one of the greatest action set pieces ever filmed. It took almost a year of preparation and more than 6 weeks of filming. It was unlike anything else at the time, and it was entirely directed by second unit director Andrew Martin, with Wilder only overseeing the shoot. What I admire about Ben-Hur is how sensitively it weaves in Jesus and this thread of divinity. He never speaks a word, we never see his face, yet his presence feels monumental. He's this being that's out of reach, yet at the same time always present in the moments that Judah needs him most. In a way, it draws contrast between petty human squabbles and these bigger works at play that really shape our world. On the other hand, not everything has aged gracefully. I really don't like Charles Heston's performance, as it feels a bit stiff and overly theatrical. Honestly, that's the case for most of the acting, and if you watch Ben-Hur in the context of 50s cinema, it really does lose some of its appeal, or it doesn't stand out as much perhaps. But as a piece of cinematic spectacle, Ben-Hur is a monument. It is the ultimate expression of Hollywood's obsession with size, scale, and eternity. It is the biggest film of the 1950s. At number 3, Seven Samurai. The story follows a small farming village in 16th century Japan that decides to hire 7 wandering samurai in a desperate attempt to defend itself from bandit raids. And against impossible odds, these warriors stand for good in the face of evil, knowing many of them will not survive. Seven Samurai is probably the most influential film on this list, a film that laid the blueprint across so many genres. Its influence can be obviously traced to The Magnificent Seven, but then to any sort of ensemble film. Whenever there's a ragtag team assembled for some impossible mission, Seven Samurai is just there in its DNA. Kurosawa's use of visual language in this film is astonishing. The geography of every action scene is crystal clear. We always know where we are and where the characters are. The rhythm of the battles is incredibly precise as well. There's often multiple layers of blocking in each scene. There's so many things going on at the same time, and the way his framing works, the way he moves the camera to set up a frame into another frame is just pure visual poetry, and characters don't tell us who they are, but they reveal it through their action. It's a masterclass in ensemble storytelling, blending action, drama, and humor so seamlessly that its epic runtime flies by. Seven Samurai is both a towering action epic and a work of visual poetry, one of the greatest films ever made, and one of those rare experiences that manages to feel timeless. At number 2, Vertigo. Vertigo tells the story of a retired detective who becomes caught in a spiral of obsession, illusion, and fatal desire that blurs the line between reality and charm. The innovation and technical brilliance in this film is clear from the opening credits. Saul Bass's hypnotic spirals and Bernard Herrmann's haunting score pull you into this world before the story even begins. But perhaps the most impressive is just how concise and lean this film is. There is no extra fat. Every scene and every shot feel like they have a clear purpose. In many ways, Vertigo is the least Hitchcock film. It's less a tightly wound thriller and more of a surreal, dreamlike descent into obsession. This is Hitchcock at the height of his powers, experimenting within his own form. It feels closer to dream noir than traditional suspense. In fact, it perhaps invented the subgenre of dream noir that we would then see explored in other masterpieces. Narratively, Vertigo doesn't add up as neatly as Hitchcock's other 1950s classics like Rear Window or Dial M for Murder or Strangers on the Train. I mean, there's just too many to pick from. And when I first saw it, I actually preferred those with their sharp logic and elegant premises. But with repeat viewings, I found that Rear Window and others lose some of their magic, while Vertigo gains more and more. Once you understand that it's about mood and tone rather than plot mechanics, it becomes one of the most rewarding films to revisit. At its core, it might be the greatest film ever made about obsession. In short, Vertigo is Hitchcock's strangest, most haunting film, and many say his most personal. At number 1, Tokyo Story. So while making this list, I really had a tough time deciding what the definitive number 1 film would be. I've seen Tokyo Story before and I considered it a great film, but I didn't initially think it to be in the running for number 1. But then I went on this Japanese cinema watching spree. I watched Mizoguchi films, I watched all of Kurosawa notables, I watched Kobayashi and Ichikawa anti-war films, and finally it was Ozu that remained. And me and Ozu didn't click immediately. His minimalist approach, a combination of slow pace and distinct visual style, takes some time getting used to, but once you understand this game, each subsequent film feels like being gently wrapped in a warm blanket. His 50s filmography can rival anyone in any decade, and although his films all follow similar style and themes, they always move me in the most profound human ways, without ever feeling emotionally exploitative. At the time of their release, Ozu films were considered too Japanese for Western audiences, so they never got distributed as much as his contemporaries. This is kind of ironic because today I think his films are perhaps the most universal out of any filmmaker in this era. Tokyo Story is the final and best part of what is known as the Noriko trilogy. Films that aren't narratively linked, but they all feature variations of a young woman named Noriko. Like most of Ozu's films, Noriko films all share the themes of a middle-class family life, generational conflict, and shifting traditions in Japan. There are no villains in Tokyo Story. The closest to a villain are some of his children, but Ozu never judges them. They aren't portrayed as bad people. If anything, they are portrayed as incredibly relatable. In their seeming neglect of their parents, we see ourselves, and Ozu gives us time to think and reflect on our own lives and choices. Is this perhaps why so many people refer to him as a teacher? I ended my 40s list with Roger Ebert talking about the greatness of Citizen Kane. And well, it just so happens to be that I think one of the most beautiful reviews he's ever written was about Tokyo Story. So I'll just read a part of it that I think describes its greatness more eloquently than I ever could. Tokyo Story lacks sentimental triggers and contrived emotion. It looks away from moments a lesser movie would have exploited. It doesn't want to force our emotions, but to share its understanding. It does this so well that I'm near tears in the last 30 minutes. It ennobles the cinema. It says yes, a movie can help us make small steps against our imperfections. It does this with characters so universal that we recognize them instantly, sometimes in the mirror. It was made 50 years ago in Japan by a man who was born 100 years ago this year, and it is about our families, our natures, our flaws, and our clumsy search for love and meaning. It isn't that our lives keep us too busy for our families. It's that we have arranged them to protect us from having to deal with questions of love, work, and death. We escape into truisms, small talk, and distractions, given the opportunity at a family gathering to talk about our hopes and disappointments. We talk about the weather and watch TV instead.